Eric Lawson and David Harris never imagined their lives would collide in a way that would shake the entire town of Cedarville. One was a quiet handyman living on the outskirts, keeping to himself. The other, a fearless journalist digging into secrets that someone had buried forever. When David's body was discovered in an abandoned warehouse and Eric became the prime suspect, the town was thrown into a whirlwind of fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that what seemed obvious was anything but, and the truth would shock everyone involved. The small town of Cedarville had always been the kind of place where life moved slowly and everyone knew everyone else. Its streets were lined with old maple trees, their leaves turning gold and red as autumn settled in. Children played freely in yards, bikes leaned against fences, and neighbors exchanged warm greetings on morning walks. The town had a sense of safety and predictability, a feeling that nothing could ever really go wrong here. People took comfort in routine. From the corner bakery that opened at 6 each morning to the tiny diner where locals gathered for coffee and gossip. It was the kind of town that felt immune to the darker events of the outside world. That sense of security vanished one chilly October morning when a local shop owner discovered something horrifying. While taking his usual shortcut through an abandoned warehouse by the river, he noticed a door slightly ajar. Curious, he stepped inside, expecting to find the usual piles of old boxes and dust-covered equipment. Instead, he stumbled upon a scene that made his stomach turn, the body of a man lying face down on the cold concrete floor. The warehouse, which had long been a forgotten part of town, suddenly became the center of fear and speculation. The victim was a well-known journalist named David Harris, someone who had earned the respect of many in Cedarville. He was known for his relentless pursuit of truth, often uncovering corruption that others preferred to keep hidden. His articles had stirred conversations, some welcoming, some controversial, but nobody had imagined his investigative work would make him a target. The moment the authorities were alerted, police cars arrived, their lights casting eerie reflections on the warehouse walls. Officers cordoned off the area, carefully collecting evidence, while detectives moved with methodical precision, examining every detail. Among the scattered papers and broken crates, a single note caught the detectives' attention. Unlike anything else in the room, it was neatly folded and deliberately placed near the victim's body. Written in stark, clear handwriting were the words, "Truth has a price." It was both cryptic and chilling, hinting at a motive that was more calculated than random. The detectives took photographs, bagged the note as crucial evidence, and began reconstructing the scene. Footprints led toward a narrow alley behind the warehouse, and witnesses reported seeing a strange car parked nearby the previous evening. Each piece of information added to a growing puzzle, though none provided a clear picture of who could commit such a crime in a town that had never experienced anything like it. As the news spread through Cedarville, a quiet tension settled over the streets. People spoke in hushed tones at the grocery store, lingering outside the post office to discuss theories. Children were kept indoors, and parents walked their routes with a sharper sense of awareness. The town that once thrived on trust and routine now found itself gripped by fear, wondering if someone among them could harbor the capacity for such violence. Every door was suddenly locked, every shadow seemed suspicious, and the familiar streets became a backdrop for questions that had no immediate answers. Life, as it had been known, had changed in an instant, leaving the community unsettled, anxious and desperate for the truth behind a crime that seemed impossible to fathom. Police investigation quickly zeroed in on a man named Eric Lawson, a local handyman known to many in Cedarville but familiar to few on a personal level. Eric had always kept to himself, living alone in a small, modest house on the edge of town. His days were filled with odd jobs fixing leaky pipes, repairing fences, or helping neighbors with minor renovations. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and reliable, but also distant, someone who never shared much about his life or thoughts. That reserved nature, which had once gone unnoticed, now drew scrutiny as detectives wondered if someone so withdrawn could harbor dark intentions. The connection to the victim began to emerge after interviews with townspeople and acquaintances. Several people reported having seen Eric in heated conversation with David Harris days before the murder. While the arguments had appeared minor, a disagreement over property boundaries, or a local issue, it raised eyebrows when viewed in the context of the crime. Investigators began piecing together a timeline, tracking Eric's movements and cross-referencing them with witness accounts and surveillance footage. The more they dug, the more he seemed like the natural person to suspect, though nothing had yet proven his guilt. As forensic evidence was processed, it appeared to strengthen the case against him. Eric's fingerprints were found on the note left at the scene, suggesting he had at least handled it at some point. Additionally, traces of mud that matched the warehouse floor were discovered on his shoes. Each new detail seemed damning, forming a chain of connections that the detectives could not ignore. Yet, there were inconsistencies that refused to align. Eric had no prior criminal record, no history of violent behavior, and his alibi, while imperfect, was supported by multiple accounts. There were moments when he appeared genuinely perplexed by the questions posed to him, leading some investigators to question whether he was truly the perpetrator or simply an unfortunate person caught in an unlucky series of circumstances. Meanwhile, the town itself began to react to the mounting suspicion. Gossip spread quickly, fueled by a mixture of fear and curiosity. People who had once waved at Eric on the street now avoided his gaze. Rumors circulated, and friends of the victim whispered about the strange coincidence of Eric's presence near the warehouse. The atmosphere grew heavier, tinged with a sense of inevitability that someone had to be guilty, and perhaps it was the quiet handyman who had always blended into the background. Detectives, however, remained cautious. They knew from experience that appearances could be deceiving and that small towns often harbored secrets that were not immediately visible. They continued collecting evidence, interviewing everyone who might have information, and watching Eric's behavior closely. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, there remained a nagging question: could someone so ordinary, so unremarkable in the eyes of the community, commit such a calculated and shocking act? As the days passed, the investigation intensified. The pressure on Eric increased, and the boundary between suspicion and certainty grew thinner, setting the stage for a confrontation that would reveal far more than anyone in Cedarville expected. After days of careful observation and evidence gathering, detectives decided it was time to bring Eric Lawson in for a formal interrogation. The room was small and sterile, with pale walls and a single table in the center. A bright overhead light cast sharp shadows, emphasizing the tension that seemed to hang in the air. Eric was asked to sit, and he did so calmly, his expression unreadable. At first, the questions were routine, where he had been the night of the murder, what he remembered about his interactions with the victim, and details about his daily life. Eric responded in short, precise sentences, his tone steady and controlled. There was a sense of careful calculation in the way he answered, as if every word had been weighed before leaving his lips. The detectives began to present the evidence they had collected, piece by piece. Photographs of the crime scene were laid on the table, followed by the note found near the body. They asked Eric to explain his fingerprints and the traces of mud that matched the warehouse floor. Each new piece of information seemed to probe deeper than the surface, testing his composure and forcing him to react under pressure. For hours, the questioning continued in this deliberate, controlled rhythm, with detectives carefully watching every flicker of emotion and subtle shift in his posture. Eric's calmness persisted, but small signs of strain began to appear. His hands twitched slightly, and a faint tension in his jaw suggested that the controlled exterior might be wearing thin. As the interrogation progressed, the detectives intensified their approach. They reframed questions, introduced timelines, and asked for clarifications on inconsistencies in his statements. Eric responded, but each answer required more effort to maintain the facade of calm. His eyes, once steady, began darting briefly toward the corners of the room as though searching for an escape. Subtle changes in breathing and posture told the investigators more than words ever could. Every glance, every pause became a clue, a hint that the composed exterior might be fracturing under the pressure of scrutiny. Despite the growing tension, Eric still did not speak impulsively. He seemed acutely aware of the stakes, aware that any misstep could seal his fate. Yet the detectives noticed that as hours passed, his energy began to shift. He leaned forward slightly, gripping the edge of the table, and there was a tightening around his eyes and mouth that betrayed stress. The room, which had felt clinical and controlled at the start, now carried an almost tangible weight, as if the walls themselves absorbed the tension. The longer the interrogation lasted, the more it became clear that this was not just a test of honesty, it was a test of endurance, of psychological limits, and Eric was approaching the edge of his own. The detectives continued methodically, layering evidence with pointed questions and subtle observations, pushing Eric to react without revealing the full extent of their strategy. Every minute brought a new challenge, a new chance for a slip, and Eric's meticulous control was beginning to show cracks. The shift was slow, almost imperceptible, but the professionals watching him knew it was happening. In the quiet intensity of the interrogation room, the calm handyman of Cedarville faced a crucible that would soon strip away the carefully maintained exterior and reveal something much deeper, something that no one had anticipated. Hours into the interrogation, the carefully maintained calm of Eric Lawson began to fracture. At first, it was subtle, a quick clench of his fists, a slight tightening of his shoulders, the occasional hesitation before answering a question. The detectives noticed these shifts immediately, reading them as signals of growing stress, but Eric continued to speak in measured tones. His composure seemed almost mechanical, a thin veneer over the rising tension beneath. The detectives intensified their questioning, carefully pressing him on inconsistencies in his statements, revisiting the evidence, and pointing out the proximity of his fingerprints and the traces of mud found on his shoes. Each question chipped away at the armor he had built around himself, testing not only his memory but his ability to remain calm under pressure. As the interrogation entered its third hour, Eric's body language began to betray him more clearly. He shifted in his chair, his breathing became shallower, and the occasional twitch of his hands grew more pronounced. The detectives could see the strain in his eyes, the subtle widening of pupils, the fleeting expressions of frustration that passed almost too quickly to notice. There was a nervous energy radiating from him, a combination of fear, confusion, and mounting anger. The detectives watched silently, recognizing that the controlled exterior was beginning to crumble, that Eric was reaching a psychological breaking point. Then, in an instant, the veneer snapped. With a sudden, explosive motion, Eric slammed his hands on the table, causing pens and papers to jump in the brief shockwave. His face flushed, veins standing out in his neck, his voice rising with a mix of anger and panic. Words spilled out in a torrent, often fragmented and unstructured, revealing emotions he had been suppressing for hours. The detectives leaned back slightly, allowing him space, knowing that this outburst was more than just a loss of control, it was a revelation. The intensity of the moment made it impossible to ignore the significance of what he was saying, even amid the chaos of his expression. In the midst of his emotional collapse, Eric revealed a critical detail without fully realizing its importance. He mentioned the location of an item in the warehouse that had gone unnoticed by investigators until that moment, an item that directly connected him to the scene of the crime in a way that could not be dismissed. The detectives immediately recognized the significance of this information, understanding that the slip was not a fabricated story or a diversion, but an unintentional disclosure caused by the stress and pressure of the interrogation. The item itself became a tangible link, something concrete that tied him to the events of that night. The sudden shift transformed the atmosphere in the room. What had been controlled and tense became charged with revelation. Eric's loss of composure had provided the breakthrough the investigation desperately needed, exposing a detail that had eluded weeks of meticulous detective work. In that single, chaotic moment, the carefully constructed narrative of innocence and suspicion collided, leaving both Eric and the detectives facing the undeniable reality that the answers they sought had been hidden within the unraveling of a man pushed beyond his limits. The interrogation, intended to test truth and lie, had become the very instrument through which the truth emerged, unfiltered and raw. Once the overlooked item was retrieved from the warehouse, the investigation took an unexpected turn. The evidence clearly connected Eric Lawson to the scene, but further analysis revealed a complexity no one had anticipated. The item itself, a small recording device, contained footage that would rewrite the understanding of the murder entirely. It showed interactions between the victim and a third party, someone who had been manipulating events from behind the scenes. Eric had not intended to harm David Harris, and his proximity to the crime had been carefully orchestrated to make him appear guilty. The realization hit the detectives like a shockwave. Eric had been a pawn in a far more intricate scheme. As the footage was scrutinized, the identity of the true culprit became apparent. The person on camera had used the warehouse, the note, and even Eric's predictable routines to craft a scenario where suspicion would naturally fall on him. Every step had been calculated, every detail planned to create a convincing narrative of guilt. The revelation was startling, not just for the investigators, but for the town itself. Eric, who had been vilified in whispered conversations and cautious glances, was in fact innocent of the crime. His breakdown during the interrogation, which had seemed like a moment of guilt or confession, was actually the catalyst that uncovered the truth. The town of Cedarville experienced a mixture of relief and lingering unease as the investigation reached its climax. The person who had orchestrated the murder was arrested, and the motives behind the crime were revealed to be personal, rooted in long-standing grievances and secret dealings that had gone unnoticed by the public. The community, once shaken by fear and suspicion, now faced the difficult task of reconciling the reality that appearances could be so deceiving. Eric's ordeal highlighted the danger of assumptions and the fragility of trust in a town that had long believed in the predictability of everyday life. For Eric, the aftermath was a complex mixture of vindication and residual trauma. He had been publicly accused and internally scrutinized, his reputation nearly destroyed by suspicion alone. Though the truth had cleared his name, the emotional toll of hours spent under intense interrogation and the stress of being implicated in a murder weighed heavily. Friends and neighbors who had avoided him slowly returned, their caution replaced with cautious curiosity and apology. The experience left a permanent mark on the community, serving as a reminder of how quickly fear could escalate and how easily an innocent person could become ensnared in a carefully constructed web of deceit. The case became a subject of fascination beyond Cedarville, studied by law enforcement for its lessons in interrogation, evidence evaluation, and human behavior under pressure. Eric's loss of control, once feared as an indication of guilt, was ultimately the key to unraveling the crime. The murder had exposed hidden motives, secret manipulations, and the dangers of jumping to conclusions, leaving the town and the investigators with a profound understanding of how truth can be hidden in plain sight. In the end, Cedarville slowly returned to its quiet rhythms, but the shadow of the case lingered, a reminder that the calmest façades can hide unexpected truths and that the pressure of a single moment can reveal what careful planning and deception cannot.